Many of us think of America as the land of the free, but it hasn't always been that way for everyone. Slavery was a way of life here that began in colonial times. The life of a slave was not an easy one. They were mainly Africans, men, women, and children. They were captured from their homes and brought on the long journey to America and the West Indies in slave ships. They were put into chains and suffered under such atrocious conditions that many died on the journey. When they arrived in America, they were sold to work for no money and in very poor conditions. Slaves were made to work all day in the fields under the hot sun. They were given very little food or water. Many were whipped by their owners. The landowners who treated them so harshly had big farms called plantations, where they grew crops such as cotton, sugarcane, and tobacco. Using slaves to tend to their crops meant that these landowners could keep all of the profit. Slaves were traded and sold like things instead of people. This continued for more than 200 years. It wasn't until 1865 that people could no longer be treated as property and forced to work against their will.
The Underground Railroad was a secret network of people who helped slaves escape from their owners in the South to freedom in the North or Canada. Runaway slaves were guided by so-called conductors, people who wanted to help them. They arranged to get them to safe houses or stations where they were offered food and shelter. They usually hid during the day and traveled at night in wagons, on horseback, or by foot. Stations were about 20 miles apart. A lantern outside the house sent a secret message to the slaves that this house was safe. Once a slave had reached one station, a coded message would be sent to the next one. The most famous conductor who helped slaves move from station to station was Harriet Tubman. She was once a slave herself, but escaped to the North. She helped over 300 other slaves find their way to freedom without ever being caught. It was a dangerous journey for the runaway slaves. Even when they reached the northern states where slavery had become illegal, if they were caught, they could still be returned to their masters in the South. But many took the risk. Some estimates say that up to 100,000 slaves found their path to freedom through the Underground Railroad.
In the United States in the early 1800s, there was a movement to end slavery, to abolish it altogether. More and more people were calling for an end to the buying and selling of black people to work on plantations. Huge farms in the southern states, which grew cotton and tobacco. Abolitionists believed slavery was wrong and should be against the law. They included famous people such as Harriet Tubman, who had escaped and helped others to get away to free states in the North, and Frederick Douglass, who'd also been a slave and became a journalist campaigning against slavery. Both Tubman and Douglass helped to rescue thousands from slavery by guiding them on the dangerous journey to freedom. Abolitionists thought everyone should know about the mistreatment of slaves. But slave owners in the South did not agree. The disagreement between abolitionists in the northern states and slave owners in the South was so big that it divided the country. This was one of the main causes of the Civil War. President Lincoln listened to the abolitionists like Douglass. Lincoln wanted the country to be united and believed that black people had the right to freedom. During the war in 1863, President Lincoln wrote something called the Emancipation Proclamation in support of setting slaves free. This focused attention on slavery. While it did not free all slaves, it was an important first step. Just 2 years later, the 13th Amendment ended slavery in this country for good.
On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The document would eventually lead to the end of slavery in the United States. The country was in the midst of the Civil War. 11 southern states had seceded or broken away from the Union to form the Confederacy. The war had several causes, but the main issue was slavery and states' rights regarding the practice of slavery. Fearing the federal government would outlaw the institution, the southern states formed their own government. The southern economy relied heavily on slave labor. Large plantations required many workers to plant and harvest crops, especially cotton and tobacco. By 1860, about 4 million slaves labored in the South. Slavery had already been abolished in most of the northern states. Still, the North was not fighting to end slavery. Its main goal at the start of the war was to preserve the Union, to keep the United States together as one nation after the South seceded. President Lincoln wanted to free the slaves, but he was afraid the states that still allowed slavery might join the South. The Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery completely. It declared freedom for slaves living in states controlled by the Confederacy. The proclamation also allowed black people to serve in the Union Army. By the end of the war, more than 185,000 African Americans had signed up to fight for their country. They helped turn the tide of the war. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The Civil War, the deadliest war in American history, was over. As the end of the war approached, President Lincoln fought for a constitutional amendment that would officially end slavery in the United States. On January 31, 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment. Lincoln has since become known as the Great Emancipator.
The civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s was about fairness and equality.
America's integrity in all of its world endeavors is being weighed on the scales of racial justice.
Many peaceful demonstrations like this march shed light on how important changes were needed. At that time, children were separated into all-black schools and all-white schools, and rode buses for long distances from one side of the city to another. People began to take a stand against the laws that prevented them from attending school together. Civil rights activists sang songs and made signs demanding equal rights to good schools and good jobs.
And I think the conscience of America is beginning to awaken. The only thing that we are demanding is that we be allowed to move ahead just like any other American citizen.
And change did come. In 1954, the laws that separated black and white children into different schools were made illegal. 10 years later, even stronger laws were passed to help put an end to discrimination.
Rosa Parks, riding a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. By refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger, she started one of the largest movements against segregation in history. Like many other public places, buses in Montgomery were segregated. White passengers should sit in the front and African Americans in the back. If the white section was full, the African Americans had to give up their seats. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was asked by the bus driver to stand up and let a white passenger use her seat. But she refused. She said she was tired of giving in. The bus driver called the police and Rosa was arrested. In protest, members of the African American community decided to boycott the city's buses. Instead, they would take a cab or walk to work. The boycott, which was led by a young reverend named Martin Luther King, was very successful. The bus companies suffered without their African American passengers. After 382 days of boycotts, the protesters won. The law was lifted and segregation was no longer allowed on buses. Rosa Parks will always be remembered for her bravery in standing up for what she believed in. She received many awards in her lifetime and has become a symbol for the civil rights movement.
White and black children together in class. But 50 years ago, things were very different in many parts of America. White and black children had to go to different schools. There were campaigns and demonstrations against this system. Eventually, in 1954, the law changed, and segregation became illegal. For black people, a change in the law didn't mean much. Black people remained barred from sharing with whites, on buses, in restaurants, hotels, and even public bathrooms. But, on September 23, 1957, an incident in an Arkansas school changed things forever. 9 black students turned up at Little Rock Central High School, where until now, there'd been only white students. Arkansas National Guardsmen and police stood by while the mob erupted into violence, and they were forced to leave. The Little Rock Nine were scared, but they returned the next day. This time, they were protected by Army troops sent by the president to help them get past the protesters and into school. This wasn't the end of the battle. During the school year, the African American students and the black communities faced more abuse and violence. But the following May, Ernest Green became the first black student to graduate from Little Rock Central High. The courageous actions of the Little Rock Nine had helped open the door to education for African Americans all across the nation. 50 years on, they're still remembered for what they did.
It's been a long time coming, but tonight, because of what we did on this day, in this election, at this defining moment, change has come to America.
Supporters gathered in Chicago to see history in the making. Obama elected as the first black president of the United States. Standing here with his family was a dream come true for the many people who had voted for him. His supporters believed he was the one to inspire them and lead them to a better future. All over the world, millions watched as history was made. Obama's grandmother, Sarah, lives in the African country of Kenya, where his father was born. This scene in the village where some of his family still live is of great contrast to the life in America. His success also marks the climax of the struggle of black Americans to be considered equally in their own country. Ann Nixon Cooper, at the age of 106, has lived since the time when black people and women did not have the right to vote. For her, it's a powerful sign of how much has changed.
I find it very thrilling, most thrilling. And I never expected it during my lifetime.
Nelson Mandela, the man known all over the world for his fight for equal rights for people of all races. He spoke out against the system in South Africa, where black people were not allowed to live or even mix with white people. Black people had to carry special passes to be allowed to work and travel.
The Africans.
When Mandela was a young man, he joined the African National Congress, an African group that fought against the apartheid system.
They want political independence.
Far from listening to their protests, the government thought they were troublemakers. Mandela was charged with trying to overthrow the government of South Africa. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Mandela spent the first 18 years of his prison sentence in an island jail, completely cut off from the outside world. He was kept in a tiny cell without even a proper bed. During the years of his imprisonment, the government prevented Mandela from receiving many visitors, in the hope that the anti-apartheid movement would die. But instead, it just grew stronger. Newspapers around the world supported him with headlines such as "Free Mandela" and "Let Mandela Go." There was even a rock concert in his support. Pressure mounted as more and more countries around the world, including Britain and the United States, condemned the apartheid system and called for Mandela's release.
An unjust system of apartheid.
Eventually, after almost 27 years in prison, Mandela was released. In the interviews that followed, he showed no bitterness towards his captors.
In prison, there have been men, who are very good, in the sense that they understand our point of view, and they do everything to try and make you as happy as possible. And that has wiped out any bitterness which a man could have.
4 years later, in 1994, South Africa allowed people of all races to vote, and Mandela was elected the country's first black president. Now he became a strong influence in the world of politics. The laws that made up apartheid were abolished. his lifelong work earned him a Nobel Peace Prize. Nelson Mandela retired after one term as president, but has traveled the world, continuing his work on equality for all. He's even appeared at pop concerts. He fought and campaigned hard to get clinics and schools opened in poor areas of the country.
When I return, as I often do, to the real rural village and area of my childhood and youth, the poverty of the people and the devastation of the natural environment painfully strike me. And in that impoverishment of the natural environment, it is the absence of access to clean water that strikes most starkly. That our government has made a significant progress in bringing potable water nearer to so many more people than was previously the case, I rate amongst the most important achievements of democracy in our country.